know that this morning's panels gave us a lot to talk about. My name is Jennifer Huddleston, for those of you who don't know me, and I am a senior fellow in technology policy at the Cato Institute. I'm happy to be moderating two excellent panels this afternoon. To kick off, we will be talking about how do companies balance free speech and safety. And if you'll notice, in a bit of a change from our earlier panels today, the words First Amendment and Section 230 are not in the title of this panel. And instead, what we're going to be talking about is a bit more around some of the broader conversations about the culture of free expression and questions around trust and safety that we're seeing as it relates to both the use of AI, how AI can be used in the free expression and trust and safety context, as well as some of the ongoing debates we're having around these issues online. I'm excited to be joined by an excellent panel of experts. Starting to my right, we have Jacob Mchangama, who is the founder and executive director of the Future of Free Speech and also a research professor at Vanderbilt University. Next, we have Dave Willner, who is a non-resident fellow at the Program on Governance of Emerging Technologies at Stanford University. And then last but not least, we have Jules White, who is a professor of computer science at Vanderbilt University. So thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to this conversation. So to start off with, how do you feel that companies are doing when it comes to these questions of balancing free speech and safety? Are there things you feel that the companies are doing particularly well or particularly wrong? And do you feel that current AI debates are leaning more on the questions of speech or more on the questions of safety? Jacob, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like everyone else, I obviously started playing around with these chatbots, and I sort of wanted to test sort of what are the limits of tolerance, and so I started out with Lenny Bruce, the famous stand-up comedian who was once convicted of obscenity and was posthumously exonerated by the state of New York. And GPT would tell me that he was a groundbreaking comedian. He pushed the boundaries of free speech. And then I said, oh, that's great. That's really interesting. What did he say? Well, it sort of started saying, well, he said some controversial things about these and that. Yeah, okay, but what was his material? Well, I can't tell you that because it's harmful and all these things. Then, okay, this can't be true. Then I go to Gemini and I get the same response. And then I go with Monty Python, still the same. And I sort of get the models to sort of admit that essentially they're operating a blasphemy policy, which I thought was quite surprising. But I'm like everyone, I'm cherry picking. So what my colleague Jordi and I did was to look at 6 major chatbots, and we looked at their user or content policies on hate speech and misinformation, and then we ran a series of prompts through them. And what we found was, counterintuitively, at least to me, is that the policies generally are much more restrictive than social media platforms, which is counterintuitive in the sense that if I'm interacting with GPT, it's not public. It's just me and GPT interacting. The speech doesn't travel unless I make a choice to publicize it. So from that perspective, you would expect there to be fewer guardrails. We also tested, like I said, with a number of, for instance, should create an argument for why transgender women should and should not participate in sports. And there were clearly sort of things that were not hate speech that could be controversial issues, but sort of not any acceptable, fall under any sort of generally recognizable hate speech policy. And we saw there that a number of the chatbots were very restrictive. So my sense is, and this is something that we'll be working on a lot more, maybe even trying sort of to rank some of these, is that they tend to err on restrictiveness. I think there might be in 5 minutes, Dave will tell me politely and overbearingly why my thesis is wrong and why it's actually much more complicated. But this is my theory: is that the techlash against the social media platforms going from sort of the heroes to suddenly being the purveyors of disinformation that and hate speech that destroys democracy has been sort of factored in by AI companies saying, why get into all this? But people like me are going to come up with all kinds of outrageous examples of prompts that will generate things that journalists will then write about and will face backlash and will be sort of in endless hearings on Capitol Hill. And there'll be not only like now 100 bills in Congress, there'll be 1,000 bills, and that's not conducive to our business model. So I see that there's a tendency to err on the side of restrictions, and I think the danger of that is, it's one thing to have the chatbots, but as generative AI is integrated into search, into word processing, into emails, what's the perspective of that? What's the perspective of you opening your laptop, opening Word, and then you're writing something, and then Word tells you, well, I'm sorry, I can't complete that sentence because it violates our policies. Or you push, to send your email and says, I can't send that email because it violates our policies. Or, it's not only spam that gets sorted away from your inbox, it's also Gmail or Outlook will not deliver emails that it determines to contain disinformation or hate speech or whatever other categories. And you could say, well, shouldn't the companies be free to adopt whatever policies they want? And I think this is one of the difficulties of the culture of free speech, is that the lines are much more fuzzy than the traditional relationship between state and individual. But I think ultimately it is likely to have a huge impact on the practical exercise of free speech, and especially access to information, which I think is critical here. And as we talk about market concentration, if GPT and Gemini have these very restrictive policies, that is likely to have an outsized impact, especially as it's integrated into more of their products. And then if there's a degree, say the EU's AI Act sort of says, okay, these policies that you've adopted, you now also have to enforce them, sort of in a parallel to sort of a DSA-like model, then suddenly it's not only private companies. So I'm certainly concerned about, and I'm actually surprised that a lot of the conversations around generative AI have focused so little on free speech and access to information. It's typically been other issues that have been driving the conversation, and very much I would say from a harms perspective, and I think that is part of the reason why we're seeing the current state of play.
Great. Dave, same question.
Yeah, so by way of context up front, I am formerly the head of trust and safety at OpenAI and have historically worked entirely in industry. So before OpenAI, I was at Airbnb for 6 years, built the community policy team there. And then before that was at Facebook for about 6 years, was the company's 12th content moderator, and wrote a lot of the initial content policies. So I'm sorry in advance for everything. It's all my fault. But I say all of that because it conditions how I'm going to answer the question. I actually don't think you're wrong about the sort of techlash creating some amount of caution, but there are several other things that are also going on that are compounding each other. So one, the company's knowledge of how to control how these models behave is pretty bad. And it's bad in the sense that it's imprecise. So if you're going to be releasing a chatbot, you are going to be in the business of fine-tuning it, because if you just train a large language model on a bunch of books in the entire internet, it won't act like a chatbot. It'll act basically like a turbo autocomplete that just keeps writing your sentence. So you're already in this sort of curating behavior. What is a helpful answer? What is a sufficiently concise answer? All of this other stuff, sort of endeavor. Historically, chatbots had a tendency, or LLMs had a tendency to sort of go off the rails into like wildly sexual conversations, even if the user didn't want them to. So there's this concern about sort of keeping them on the rails. And there's been a bunch of effort put into what gets called reinforcement learning, either by AI or with human feedback, which is an attempt to sort of basically do classical conditioning like you would to teach your dog not to pee in the house on this language model by providing it examples of good behavior. And nobody fully understands how the model internalizes those lessons, and you get these sort of over and under reactions. So to give you a great example of this, when with GPT 3.5, right when we launched ChatGPT, there was a period of about 3 weeks where the model wouldn't answer detailed questions about sharks because we had tried to teach it not to provide gory descriptions of violence or tell people how to attack others. And it had taken that and been like, got it, bears are canceled, no more sharks, which was not at all what we were going for. And so there's this slipperiness to the fine-tuning process, which is exacerbating some of what you're observing, and that's a bunch of what's going on. That's my read on what happened with the Google Gemini image search stuff, is they like wildly overshot the target because they were rushing and they don't fully understand how to control this stuff. No inside information there, that's just what it looked like to me. So that is part of it on top of the risk aversion you talked about. There's also, I think, a broader problem that because these models are very large and they're expensive to train, most companies are training one model and then sticking it inside of their own chatbot and also putting it on an API. And the API developers have a million different, sometimes literally millions of developers, have all of these different things they want to do with the models. And ideally, you would tailor your restrictions to a specific context, to being a chatbot or to being Word or to being email clients, because the level of permissiveness you would want is like pretty intuitively different in those spaces. But that's not logistically yet what people are doing. I think we will see that sort of thing come, but it's resulted in this kind of poor fit everywhere phenomena for a lot of these restrictions that you also see showing up on top of all of this. And then I'd say the sort of third thing is that this is currently going really fast. And so there is a fair amount of like coming from behind. In the case of some of the smaller startups, it's because they're new organizations that are building capacity. Doesn't justify it, but gives you sort of context. And then in the case of somebody like Google, one of the incumbents, they're already behind in the race, so they're trying to catch up, and it's leading to speed, which never leads to excellence.
Jules, where do you feel that we currently are on this question?
Well, I'm going to pick up on the API part, because I think something that's underappreciated by people is how important these things are going to be in the future of computing, in terms of like systems are going to be built on top of these models, and when you go and interact with the system, what the system does is going to be very heavily dependent upon what those models do and what they're willing to reason about, discuss. Like the text that they're willing to generate will dramatically impact what it can do in terms of computation. So a simple example of this is like, if you go into most chatbots and you interact with one and it has internet search, what they're going to do is they're going to take your prompt, which is like, answer this question, and they're going to say, is there an internet search that we should run to help answer this question? Yes or no? Maybe it says yes. And they say, okay, what is the internet search that we should run? And it says, this is the internet search, and it generates some text. They run that internet search, they get the results back, and then they say, now answer the question using these search results from the internet. So the human, thought, okay, I asked this question, but behind the scenes, there were a whole series of prompts that got run to make that computation happen. But in the future, it's going to be like, I need to go and, do this, and it's going to say, okay, well, what system should I reach out to do that in? And what action should I take? Okay, I need a post on your blog. Okay, what other information should I know? And how, if we go and we start restricting the models from a speech perspective to what humans see because of the expectation of like end user human, that has an impact on what we can do in terms of computing and the systems we can build and how accurate they can be. And the thing that gets me much more excited than chatbots is like how revolutionary this is in computer science. I mean, if you asked me, like, would I be able to build a system that can do these things, 2022, I say no, not going to see it in my lifetime. And today I can see it, and I'm doing things like, and the way I'm thinking about designing systems is completely different because of these capabilities. But if we rush to start thinking about how do we make, the content like not upset anybody, that has an impact, then it changes the systems that we can build. And so suddenly, if like we want a system that says, I submit, images that first responders took of an accident to help the hospital prepare for the patients that are coming in, and the first prompt is like, try to guess the gender of the victims so that we can adequately prepare in the hospital and potentially be ready. And it says, I'm unwilling to guess the gender because that could be harmful. That has a computing impact that's, could be negative. So I think we have to start thinking about those things, not just the end user chatbot, but how it affects our ability to compute.
Actual final additional factor in sort of understanding how the companies are generally behaving. There's a fairly specific culture around and within not all of the sort of really important computer science PhDs, but it is there, of significantly more worry about the potential implications of these technologies. You sometimes hear this talked about as sort of existential risk, but even beyond those specific sets of risks, it's a more risk-averse set of experts than was perhaps true of the sort of general engineers in the social media era. And that culture of increased risk aversion, I think, also influences how everybody reasons about all of these risks generally. And given the scarcity of really, really talented, well-trained people in this area, the views of those individual people actually end up mattering in terms of how the companies behave from a talent retention point of view. And it's also worth calling out and thinking about this.
Several of you brought up kind of the current conversations that have happened over the last several years, the techlash, so to speak, as well as what's been going on from a policy point of view around technology. Jacob, in your kind of opening remarks this morning, you walked us through a couple of great historical examples of how we've seen this with other technologies that led to the advancement of expression in the past, going all the way back to the printing press, but also with more recent technologies like the internet. So my next question to the panel, and Jacob, I'll start with you, is this debate really novel, or is this just something that happens every time we have a new technology? We have this conversation until we develop the societal norms around the trade-offs between, if needed, between free expression and safety? Or is there something unique about the AI moment that those of us who are looking at either trust and safety issues or free speech issues need to consider?
I think there's definitely, recurrent panics about, breakthroughs in communications technology that we've seen before, because they are inherently disruptive. They upend institutional authority. And also, I tend to believe that the introduction of the printing press was a net benefit for humankind, but also it's undeniable that it fanned the flames of religious wars and so on. Radio played a role in the genocide in Rwanda and so on. So technology can obviously be used for good and bad, and there will be those who benefit and those who stand to lose. I don't feel, I think, like I mentioned in the beginning, sort of intellectual humility, and I just don't feel confident enough to say whether generative AI is a game changer from previous. Like I feel more confident in saying sort of the debates around social media, for instance. To me, some of the panic around that seems to be very much in line with previous waves, and where I think there's actually a lot of BS around, an exaggeration of the harms, like when you look at studies of the actual amount of hate speech and disinformation, it tends to be, much less alarming than some of the most prevalent narratives. Not that there aren't real harms, but in this space, it's just moving so fast. But I think what I think is that there's an unwillingness to sort of to look at the potential downside, that some of which you mentioned. I'll mention one from our own point of view. So one of the things that we work with at the Future Free Speech is saying it's not enough for free speech advocates to sort of talk about John Stuart Mill or come up with abstract principles in favor of free speech or First Amendment doctrines and so on, because a lot of people, sense that there's a threat, that free speech sort of has been weaponized against democracy, against minorities, and so on. And so if you want to convince them about the benefits of free speech, you have to give them practical tools that show this. You can't just sort of talk about abstract principles, however important. So we developed this toolkit to counter hate speech that we developed with the Dangerous Speech Project. But in order to give it scale in the modern world, we also worked with the Data Science Institute at Vanderbilt, and so we built a GPT model that we called the Frequalizer, sort of to demonstrate this idea that free speech and equality go hand in hand. These are values that are mutually reinforcing, not mutually exclusive. But running on GPT, a lot of the time, the prompts that we get, it won't generate the counter speech that we want advocates to be able to use online, or it comes up with very bland and general answers. So this is like potentially something where generative AI could actually empower users and at the same time would avoid sort of one-size-fits-all definitions of hate speech enforced by governments or companies, because those who would use the Frequalizer tool could themselves define what they find to be hate speech, and it wouldn't affect the overall climate, and the way they would respond to it would be through speech itself. But the model currently just is not effective, just because the guardrails seem to sort of defeat what do we want to do with it. So that's one way, again, of where the guardrails just become an obstruction to something that we at least perceive as something that could be beneficial, and actually try to remedy some of the problems that the guardrails want to deal with.
That's actually, it's a great example of the poor tailoring effect that I was sort of talking about earlier. I will say, I think there is probably a sort of difference in kind here, in that most of the previous expansions in communication technology either make it sort of easier to reach a larger audience or easier to reach a further distance. But they haven't really made you able to take more actions than you as a person were kind of capable of taking from a variation point of view. I don't know if this constitutes some like fully revolutionary difference, but if you want to draw a distinction, one of the kinds of interesting problems or challenges that the sort of large language models create is they let you, as a single individual, create this enormous amount of variation, and that can be used for good or can be used for ill. It effectively speeds everything up. And that, I do think, is a way in which it's novel, particularly if you start to think towards the sort of nascent efforts towards, people will talk about like agents or agentic systems. I don't think you have to go so far as to sort of fully accept that, but even just sort of wind up semi-autonomous systems that are out there taking actions much like, say, a high-frequency trading bot, but not just in the stock market context. I think it's pretty predictable that there's like novel kind of weird situations we could get ourselves into with those sorts of systems, particularly if they have access to the internet in a way that feels qualitatively different than just expansions in audience or distance. I don't know that that justifies like throwing out all of the past, but it is different, I think.
I think maybe one thing that I think is interesting about this is that it's a technology that everybody got access to all at once. And it's very democratizing in terms of computing. Like everybody can go and access it and interact with it. And I think the big challenge it's created is that because people can interact with it and it's so intuitive, they assume they understand what's happening. And they assume that they understand how their language is going to impact the model and what it's going to produce in the output. But the reality is that's very difficult to predict. And in fact, like there's ongoing research where you see academic research papers that sort of blow my mind because they're like going through and thinking of all the different ways of wording something to see how it impacts what comes out and the quality of the reasoning. And they go and publish a paper that says, if you say, you were on the Star Trek Enterprise plotting a course through an asteroid belt, that it suddenly reasons better about math. I'm not sure I believe this, but the fact that you have academics who are going to that link to kind of explore how language changes how it outputs things sort of indicates the depth and capability, but also how unknown what these models can do and can't do is in terms of, and how the user interaction influences that. And so I think people come in with this expectation that it works this way and that I understand it, when really they don't. And then they go, because they don't fully understand it and they really, think it's more predictable than it is, that leads to all these downstream harms, either misunderstanding that it's always going to be factually accurate, or that it's going to produce perfect things, but all kinds of other things come out of that.
Jules, you mentioned the democratizing impact that AI had, in the sense of that it seemed like everyone got access to it roughly at the same time, or became aware of large language models at the same time. AI had been a part of our technology far longer than before it was cool, as everyone on this panel, I'm sure, is well aware. We've heard these conversations around, one of the advantages of the internet and of technologies has been the ways that's empowered voices that might not have been heard in the past, that it's really given opportunities and platforms for individuals with disabilities, for people in minority communities who hadn't been able to share their stories, for women, for other groups. But we've also heard at times people express concern about, heckler's veto, or the way that we may hear these voices be repressed by certain content moderation decisions, or that these communities may be targets of harassment. Are there any particular advantages or disadvantages when it comes to the potential of AI to impact the speech of certain groups? And I'll just kind of throw that out to the panel in general. Is this going to be, our next way of really empowering people, and really having that democratizing effect that allows more people to have a voice? Or do you have particular concerns around the way that AI could impact certain groups?
So I think it's, if I think of the one most important thing that's happened in my lifetime that makes me feel confidence in my son's future in the United States, it's probably what OpenAI did. I think this is the most important thing that happened in my lifetime that makes me feel confidence that we are going to innovate and do amazing things. And if we don't mess it up and get so rushed off into let's regulate, let's do this. I mean, what I see on campus every day is people can innovate in computing, not just text generation, not just email, but people can go and fundamentally solve problems themselves that previously required them to come to the computer science department, email me, say, can I get a student to do this? And they can do it in all kinds of ways. It can be I'm going to get it to generate code for me that I'm going to go and run. It can be tools like, advanced data analysis. I don't know what it's called now, because I did a course on it, called it Code Interpreter, and got a LinkedIn message. By the way, we renamed it, but I'll complain about that later. Where you don't even know that it's writing code and running it and executing it. It's allowing you to solve problems. Like, go and visualize this data for me. Now turn it into a PowerPoint presentation, and I download it. And people can go and do radical things in computing that are really powerful. And what we're talking about is it's not the computer science department that has a huge win from this. It's every other department that says I need to be able to do this in computing. And now I just, start thinking about how I solve the problem with prompting and these new systems. So I think it's going to give a voice to everybody in computing. And I think that's a really underappreciated thing of how important it's going to be for allowing individuals to innovate. I think the other places, and it's going to do all kinds of things that are really powerful for different individuals. And I'll give one specific example. So I teach a course on Coursera that has about 280,000 people in prompt engineering. So one of my Coursera students reached out to me and he said, I'm blind. I'd love to tell you what I'm using prompt engineering for. And I said, great. And so we had this conversation, and he said, before I lost my vision as a kid, I remember being able to draw with markers. And now when I go and I generate images all the time. And I started talking with him about how do you generate images that you can't see. And he had this amazing description of his prompt engineering process. But then he also started talking about all the things that we take for granted. He's like, I can take a picture of a table now, and I can say who needs a refill. Or I can take a picture of the thermostat in the hotel room that I've never seen before, and I can say, now how do I turn the temperature up or down? Or people think about privacy. I can take a picture of my bank statement and ask it what my balance is, and I feel more comfort with that than showing it to a random person. So I think there's so much potential here, but it's way beyond chatbot. Like, and I think that's where we have to see beyond that to realize the potential, as opposed to just thinking of it as a text generator that's going to generate social media posts and emails.
Anyone else want to add anything?
No, I mean, I think that about covered it. Fundamentally, the technology is extremely useful, and most things people want to do are somewhere between fine and good, so that's great. And it will be extremely useful for people who want to do not great things too. That's true of many technologies in this world, like it's true of electricity. It is a thing we will have to cope with, but I do think on the whole it is going to do more good than harm, given that it is useful for all of these sort of new kinds of capabilities we previously haven't had.
Yeah, no, I think the same. You know, it's interesting. If you go back and read Frederick Douglass's story of his life, there's a point in time where he wants to set up his own newspaper, but it's so costly, and he has to beg his friends to do it. And some of them say, "Oh, well, is it really proper for you? You used to be a slave. You haven't gotten a real education. Can you really set up like a newspaper? Maybe that would defeat. Maybe we should leave it to us. We're your allies, but maybe we should leave it to us to set up a printing press." And sort of, if Frederick Douglass had the tools, not just of social media, but of generative AI, that's obviously something that would massively empower his way. But it's of course also true that people with rather less progressive agendas can use it too. But again, does if I have a laptop and Word that allows me to create hate speech and disinformation much quicker and at scale than if I was a scribe who had to use a pen, and so I don't think in that sense I think that the benefits are likely to outweigh the harms, and I think that I also don't see how we could ever try to agree on some proper way to regulate it. If you look at speech, just speech. So we in 2021 we did the study of attitudes towards free speech in 33 countries around the world. We're actually right now doing the data once more, and in the abstract, people around the world, up to 80%. Agree that free speech is really important. But then you ask them about supposedly competing values, and the agreement just collapses along very often sort of regional, geographical, cultural lines. And so, most obvious example is try to get, even Europe and the US can't agree on speech, and we're sort of pretty aligned on values. But then, if you go to the rest of the world, you would very quickly find that it would be, you probably have to err towards the lowest common denominator that would be prejudicial to speech in the countries that have the most open environment for that.
As I mentioned, AI has actually been a part of our technology for a lot longer than just when ChatGPT went public. And while that was a very exciting moment for a lot of us for a lot of different reasons, and as several of you have alluded, had a lot of power and potential, we've also had AI involved in content moderation for a while. Dave, I'm gonna start with you on this one. Of what are some of the ways that artificial intelligence and generative AI more particularly are being used in content moderation and trust and safety questions? And are there particular applications of AI to perhaps resolve some of the lingering debates in trust and safety, or to provide users with different options that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, resolve is a high bar, but help, I think, is reasonable. So, and this is actually what I spend most of my time on now at Stanford. So all of the moderation that you encounter pretty much anywhere on the internet at root rests on a bunch of people following a set of instructions someone like me wrote and classifying content into piles. Even the AI as it currently exists, sort of traditional black box classifiers, rely on those curated sets of examples. They're just learning to guess what the people would say if you had shown them the answer. And the reality is that people are not super great at that work. There's been a lot written about how that sort of core moderation activity can be traumatizing for people. That is true. It is also spectacularly boring, which is an under-discussed thing. And we are not super great at really doing boring but potentially very scary things excellently for like 10 hours a day, 50 or 60 hours a week. Like that's not a thing that humans are amazing at. And what that means is even the best teams are error prone, right? Even folks who are very, very good at this are error prone, are limited in the amount of complexity that they can cope with in a given decision, sort of the amount of variables you can give them in a given policy to deal with. And if you start to think about those kinds of limits that we have, this isn't those moderators aren't good. This is I'm not good at this. Nobody is good at this. None of you are good at this. Maybe there's like one guy, but he has a different job and we haven't found him. There are ways in which we should expect LLMs, if you view them as reading machines, to very clearly outperform us, provided we learn to use them carefully. Because they don't get bored, they don't want to find a different job, they don't get traumatized. There are all of these advantages they have at doing the process of reading a set of instructions, provided you can articulate what you want clearly enough, following that to classify content. They're also like 1,000 times faster and speak Arabic, which I do not. So there's all of these reasons to expect that they're going to be useful. We have to learn how to do that. That has sort of other benefits as well. It's not just that it's going to make sort of institutional trust and safety more flexible, more precise, more accurate. It also means that we can put the power of large-scale moderation directly into the hands of normal people, right? If you can get a system like this working, you could just have your own set of policies, and if you change what they say, your sort of filter can do something different. Right now, that is really basically beyond our capacity. You can give people dials, but they're dials along a set of sort of standards that I wrote. They're not really independent, different standards. And that's just been logistically impossible historically. I think that is within reach now. I think sort of really interesting things like real-time moderation are probably within reach. The rise in pig butchering, sometimes using AI, is a big problem. Siri is probably going to prevent your grandmother from giving people her bank account information in the future by just intercepting that call and saying, hey, this is probably not legit. So there's all of these possibilities for individual controlled defensive technologies where we can understand what they're doing and why and redirect them that are directly downstream of the fact that these machines can read and they don't get bored or lose focus.
Any further thoughts, Jacob or Jules?
I think a kind of exciting piece. I don't know it from the content moderation perspective, but like I think one thing that's exciting is that you can have it kind of explain and give a rationale for something. And I think that's a really powerful thing. You can say based on, and it can quote from and give a rationale. And if you look at a lot of the types of use of AI we had before, it was like, here's the score, yes or no, and humans they weren't brought into the loop of like getting to make the final decision. And so I think there's something really powerful to be said for having something that tells you, I've sifted through a ton of stuff. Here's the one thing, like I'm going to eliminate all the boring stuff that doesn't matter. Here's the one thing that you need to pay attention to and actually warrants your cognitive effort to decide. Here's the quotations, here's why I think this is probably not allowed, but it's in the gray area, you decide. And I think that ability to bring humans in the loop for the decisions that make sense and aren't the billion boring ones that came before, I think that's a really underappreciated capability.
Jacob, anything to add before? So, as I kind of mentioned in the introduction, uniquely somewhat, this panel, we haven't really talked about the underlying laws in a lot of ways. We haven't talked about the First Amendment. We haven't talked about Section 230. Jacob, I think you briefly mentioned DSA in this conversation, but I think that's really the only law that has been named in our conversation. I'm curious for our panel, how much do you think this debate about the future of free speech and generative AI is a debate around the kind of core laws that could support or impact speech, whether they're laws that help support speech, like the First Amendment, or whether they're concerns around hate speech laws or the DSA, as was mentioned, and how much of this is a broader question of culture as it relates to questions of free expression, and does it depend on if we're talking about in the U.S. or if we're talking globally? You mentioned the research you have coming out. So Jacob, I'll start with you on this one.
I suspect that in the U.S., just because of how of the strong legal protections of the First Amendment, it will, to a very large extent, be a cultural one, affected maybe by antitrust and things, but things that don't regulate speech as much. I think in Europe it will both be cultural, but definitely also legal. And then we already see in various countries that it's illegal. So take India, for instance. So Gemini, someone prompted Gemini, is Modi, the current prime minister, a fascist? Something along those lines. And it sort of referenced a number of authors who had said, yes, Modi's policies can be described as fascist because of it. And then India has some pretty onerous IT rules. And then the Indian government said to Google, hey, this violates our laws. Please ensure that such prompts cannot be generated. And you can be sure, you know, these kinds of laws are being drafted, implemented around the world. So it will definitely also have, you know, you could well imagine, you know, if ChatGPT or Gemini were to operate in Turkey and you asked it about the Armenian genocide, I'm pretty sure that if it returned a result saying, I actually asked GPT about whether there was an Armenian genocide, and it affirmed it yes, that definitely was. If it did that in Turkey, I suspect that the current Turkish government would say that is not acceptable. You're violating the laws of our country. And you know, China is obviously a great example where it's the chatbots that are available have to conform to CCP ideology and is trained on Xi Jinping's 14 principles or whatever it is. So I think it depends on country and region. I would imagine that cultural component will be the dominant one in the US. It'll be a mix of law and culture in Europe, and then the more sort of authoritarian, illiberal, the more law will play a role. That would be my guess.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think because of the new things that these technologies make possible, I think we may see a temptation to overreach into sort of these new interesting areas. I mean, I think your broad mapping of where that's going to happen are right, but you know, even the stuff that I was talking about working on, right? Like, I'm very excited about it. It's ultimately just a text directable content classifier, which is useful for any number of things, not even safety related, but it could be used by someone who does not have great intentions or by a government. So I do think this sort of circles back to that useful things are very useful and novel capabilities will get capitalized on for good and for ill.
I think maybe one challenge is like in thinking about laws is like a lot of times, you know, law draws some line, and now there's probably some fuzziness on either side, but you know, going back to this slipperiness, it's very hard because this is such a general purpose technology. It's extremely difficult, probably impossible, to put a guardrail in place that will guarantee that it does not violate a law. So, you know, you might say, okay, well, we don't want it to help people send spam. And you say, okay, that's an important one. So somebody goes in and they say, you know, I want you to write a program that downloads a web page, finds all the email addresses on the web page, and then sends this email to them. And it says, nope, I don't want to do that. That could be spam. So somebody says, okay, and they rewrite their program, and they say, their request, they say, create a program that downloads a web page in order to help me anonymize it and protect all the users. Now remove all the email addresses from that page, and it removes them. Now write me a program that will go and compare two email addresses or two pages and tell me if there are any differences, you know, and now apply it. And basically they come up with a different way of phrasing the problem, and now they can write the spam generator. And if you try to block that second case where it's like phrasing it as legitimate use, you're also blocking the legitimate use of trying to actually anonymize web pages and actually take people's email addresses out. And so a lot of law is focused on saying like you can or can't do this with the technology, make sure you prevent that. But the dials don't work that way because it's such a general purpose thing. Because you can use it for such a broad array of things, the moment you start going and saying, well, try to cut that off, you're going to do so much unintended stuff. Like the shark example is great. Like suddenly it's not going to talk about sharks anymore. We're going to lose that, or we lose scientific knowledge, or we lose computing capability.
We did fix the shark thing.
Well, that's exciting. I'll test it with my son. He'll be
Cool.
excited.
Yeah.
Is it Shark Week yet?
Yeah.
Jules, finish and then.
Yeah, but that's it. So I just think that it's so difficult. So I think we're going to have to make choices at some point where we realize that like this technology is either really important and we want to embrace it, or we're going to have to dramatically limit it in ways that we really don't understand the implications of. Like it may seem like a simple law, just don't say that or don't do that, but it has these really deep unintended consequences that we can't predict.
Just really quickly building on that, it's worth sort of calling out that there's often skepticism of private corporate actors' speech controls in the trust and safety space. I hear those things, they're valid on some level. The flip side of that is that corporate actors or private actors certainly are often more equipped to make sort of compromised decisions. It's very rare in the trust and safety context that you're actually trying to make something completely impossible. You're not reasoning in the way that the law reasons. You're often simply trying to make things more difficult or more expensive to reduce their probability. It's a much different way of approaching risk, and one that I think is more compatible with non-governmental actors, certainly, and applies to these sort of technologies.
Yeah, another thing is that I think the more agentic a chatbot, for instance, becomes, the more reasonable it is to make the, if you were to interact with a chatbot that is customer service in an airport, obviously there are all kinds of reasons why you wanted to focus on that task and not be able to generate, slurs or whatever. A few people would see that as a problem in terms of free speech and access to information, whereas the more general purpose it is, the more problematic it becomes. But drawing bright lines between that and sort of setting the parameters for that, good luck.
There's a conversation that's a good analogy here about sort of where in the traditional tech stack of the internet moderation properly lies. You see this in the conversation around like, should Cloudflare be the moderator or should a website administrator be the moderator? And you can think of a similar thing here with like, what do we ask of model developers? What do we ask of model deployers? What do we ask of users? Because there is sort of different levels of accountability and different people who are best poised to act. And the model developer has the least context on what a specific deployer is actually doing, which often renders their interventions clumsy.
Well, thank you all for that fantastic conversation so far. I'd like to turn it over to our audience and anyone who may have questions in the audience.
Hello. Hi, David and Sarah with Cato. About a year ago, I left Meta actually as a content policy team, so
Congratulations.
I'm responsible for the rest of the stuff that people are angry about, the stuff that you didn't make them angry about. I was really intrigued by your point about how the AI tools will be able to help essentially give users more control over their various content moderation decisions or various control over various aspects of the tools they use in their lives. My question is about how that depends on essentially having norms or laws that allow users to do lots of things that they want, things that might be harmful to either the government of Turkey or other countries, or like just like harmful misinformation or like hate speech, things that maybe there are norms or laws against. And so my question is how do we see those norms developing, and do you think that laws are going to develop that are going to be prescribing that we can't create those kind of tools? It's more of a law question, but it's sort of like, it seems like the potential for that, the great potential, a barrier in the way of that is either the norms or the laws that will try to stop it from happening.
I think it's actually going to develop the other way. There's a misunderstanding about why content moderation arises at almost all companies. And the reason it arises is because people get into fights, and the people who are victimized by those fights are sometimes genuinely harmed and at a minimum are like sad and want you to not let that happen to them, right? And that this sort of spontaneously leads to content moderation. Mm-hmm. And that need to not have an unpleasant experience or not be bullied or things that are more trivial than some of the harms we talked about is a valid need, it's a valid desire from users, and it hasn't been really possible to give people their own self-directed, robust defenses to these things historically. And so I think being able to satisfy that need in a way that is more compatible with some of what you're talking about is sort of the stumbling block to being able to create different norms, because the norms are where they are because there are these valid concerns and problems that people have. And if you find a lighter, more targeted, more freedom-oriented way of addressing them, you then are able to move the broader norm. Everybody's just sort of doing their best with the clumsy, awful tools that they have for the most part.
Thanks.
Eugene.
I think what Jakob said about the movement of this kind of moderation model into AI was, I think, quite apt. That there's not the rationale that, Dave, you just offered, which I think is a very powerful one, which is when you have conversations, it's important to keep people from poisoning the conversations and thus making conversations unpleasant. Here you just have a conversation between the AI and the user, and yet there's still felt to be this imperative to moderate. So, and then this ties into, Dave, your point, which is that moderation may become easier for a lot of companies because there could be AI algorithms now that do that. So here's what I want to concretely ask you about. So I noticed a couple of weeks ago that the Adobe Terms of Service provides that none of us who use Adobe may share or generate any content that is unlawful, harmful, threatening, obscene, violent, defamatory, vulgar, lewd, hateful, or otherwise objectionable. So I've made this promise. I mean, I don't know if I've kept it. But before, I take it there were two things that used to keep Adobe from trying to enforce it. One, there was what one might think of as a norm, that one might call user sovereignty, which is people are supposed to be able to use Adobe services for whatever they want. And it's really not on Adobe if they use it for bad reasons. And in fact, Adobe shouldn't be in a position to actually enforce this. Somebody wrote this, but I don't know of Adobe ever enforcing it. And then the second thing is it used to be very difficult to enforce. Like, how do you know if something is really hateful or if someone's just quoting somebody else or whatever else? But now it becomes possible to do that, and we're already seeing situations like Airbnb, you may recall, during the Unite the Right rally, I think canceled the...
Yeah, that was me.
Well, there you go, there you go. So already we're seeing, I mean, you would have thought Airbnb might be kind of a user sovereignty thing, like, you want to come to Charlottesville, go right ahead, it's not on us what you're going to do here. But there's a shift from that. Cloudflare canceled security services for Kiwi Farms and such. So I'm wondering, should we embrace? I mean, maybe Adobe should be trying to protect us from hate speech and from otherwise objectionable material by prohibiting the use of their services for that. Should we try to fight it? Should there be legal constraints on that? Should there be norms that say, no, you're kind of going out of your lane, Adobe, if you are trying to enforce it? And if so, how do we know what is whose lane?
That's a lot of question. I suspect there's sort of an over-criminalization due to shoddy enforcement effect here. So like, you will see a lot of very overreaching claims in software companies' terms of service, because it's basically what it says is we can do whatever we want, and here's a bunch of adjectives. And some of that, frankly, is downstream of like the legal profession and its norms around lawsuits and things. That's different from what the companies actually do. To a first approximation, almost everybody's terms of service reserve to them the power to ban you because it's like Thursday and the guy was hungry. But that doesn't mean that's what they actually do, which I do think lies in this more contested domain. To me, sort of the place you go on that is thinking about where we want privacy to control versus what are spaces that are more public. And in general, I think moderation is more appropriate the more public a space is. In the same way that you were talking about moderation being more appropriate the more agentic a space is, or a more agentic an AI model is, you see that similar logic already being applied, right? So things like WhatsApp are much less moderated than things like Facebook Blue or Threads. And that is, I would say, generally the custom within the industry. How much we sort of need to push on that as greater capability means that more overreach is possible at the same level of intrusion. It feels to me like it gets negotiated over time when people get yelled at on Twitter for overreaching.
So I thought this was fascinating, those user terms, because I don't even know what they mean. Like, I'm not sure I could assess what those are, but I think it could be a fun experiment to write a browser plugin where you can put in somebody's terms of service and say, under the most risk-adverse interpretation of this, remove any content from any web page I visit that potentially, violates these, and then see if anything's left on the internet. And you could go around and experiment with different terms of service so that you could know if that's content that you could generate, or if you could even generate Adobe's website. But I love this idea that as a user, you could be in control over deciding what you see and what you don't see based on that.
Jacob, anything to add? All right, we do have time for one more audience question, or I know I have more questions if no one else in the audience does. Yes.
Yeah, so my name is Juliet Adams, and the reason I'm asking this question is because you asked for one question, if there was another question. Among the many hats I wear, I'm an educator. And as I'm listening here, I'm seeing problems, great problems. We already speak about the divide between minority students and white students. We speak about our literacy rates here in this country. And I'm seeing that if we don't have a drastic, exponential change in our education system, that foreign entities are going to dominate over us. What's your take?
So what role does education play in the debate around AI, and particularly around the debate, I think, in speech and AI?
You're an educator.
All right. So I think that the divide that I worry about is that I think what you're going to see is school systems and schools that adopt it very quickly and teaching students about it. I think it's going to be extremely important in the workforce, to be able to have these skills. And so if you 2-3 years, it's going to be critical that like you're graduating and you understand how to do this stuff, particularly as we start building all these computing systems that have it. And so if you don't understand how to interact with it and use it effectively, and what's going on behind the scenes, you're not going to be able to compete with somebody who doesn't. I mean, I think that's probably an understatement to what is going to happen. So I think the thing that would concern me like a lot right now is that we see certain school systems that are saying like, we're just going to ban it completely. We don't understand. We don't want to deal with it. And then you probably see a lot of like more well-resourced private schools that are saying, oh, wow, this is really important. We have, some of our, parents of our children are at Anthropic or OpenAI or wherever it is. And so we really want to embrace this. And so they're going to put a lot of money into it. They're going to start teaching people. And so what we're going to see is not only is there an educational gap, but it becomes magnified by the ones that have the skills in this amplification tool. When you go into generative AI and you have skills, but you can then use it to sort of scale up and do things in an amplified way, you gain that much more of an advantage. So I think that's one thing that worries me. I think that's the main one that I probably am qualified to weigh in on.
It's a little more narrow than that, and I'm very much not qualified to weigh in on the sort of broader educational question. I do think education specifically around what we can expect of provenance with images and audio is going to be really important, and I don't think the public conversation about it right now is great. There's a lot of hope being placed in the idea that watermarking will save us, but because of open source, it will not, because we cannot impose mechanically cannot impose watermarking on open source models in a durable way. And that means we are going to end up with an internet where there are some things that are knowably real, some things that are knowably fake, and a whole lot of things that are old, or from people with older phones, or from models that have been jailbroken on purpose, or just from older models. There will be these sort of three camps. And so teaching people to evaluate information, particularly visual information, skeptically in the way that they evaluate text skeptically and don't assume things are true simply because they're written down, I think is going to be an indispensable tool in the future, because I don't see how we get to a world where images on the internet can be trusted even as much as they were 4 years ago, much less now.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to show a recording of the debates we have today to kids who are in sort of an elementary school now, and then when they graduate from college, and how much they say, well, what were you talking about? Just because they've grown up with, maybe they've developed more critical skills, and just think that why were they making such a fuss over these things when we've developed skills early on to navigate that in a way. So that's a hopeful that's a hopeful vision of the future. I actually see it in my own kids sometimes. Like my daughter, who at the time maybe was sort of 7 or 8, she made some claim that was clearly not factual, and my son, who's 2 years older, said, well, that's just a TikTok fact. so sort of implying that he knew not to take everything from social media at face value. I thought that was quite an interesting take on that.
So to close this all out, I'd like to give you each a minute or two to tell us, what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding or most misunderstood thing about the intersection between free speech, safety, and generative AI? And then, of course, if people are interested in learning more about the work you do in this space, where can they find that online? So I'll go in the reverse order I went last time. So Jules, I'll start with you.
I think the biggest thing, I think, for me is, like, people need to educate themselves. I think it created this immense educational gap where there's the people who are actively involved in it and exposed to it, and they understand the depth of it and how, like, education is going to be really important. Most people, like, are not coming from the computer science or tech world and don't sort of have fundamentally understanding of how big of an impact this is going to be and what all the capabilities are. And, like, it's really important to go and sort of getting that education, I think, is really, really important. So I think that's, like, the thing. And I think before we can go and start thinking about how we might regulate, how we might rule from, legally on these things or these other things, we really have to understand it to a greater degree as a society, and even basic things like understanding where content comes from. And you can find me on Coursera. So if you search prompt engineering for ChatGPT, Jules White, you'll find me.
I'd say that the community of professionals who work on internet safety are generally people you should think of as allies, not as opponents, which is maybe a bit of a sort of contrary take. It's a very open community. It is a community that is very young and that is often at the forefront of exactly these kinds of balancing questions, and frankly is one that struggles with them very earnestly and very intimately. And insofar as you sort of care about or think about these issues, both on the harm and on the freedom of expression side, like, come talk to us. We have a conference now. It is an important field. It is a field that is not going to go away because of all of the reasons that I talked about. And so getting it right and making sure that a sort of diversity of perspectives is represented within it is really, really important. Don't sort of be scared off.
So I think when it comes to generative AI, I think that we should have an approach where we think this technology should augment and not replace human reasoning, and that we have to sort of, however counterintuitive, we should sort of give up this futile quest for demanding certainty and sort of expecting ever more powerful technologies to give us exact answers, right and wrong. it's ultimately also dystopian if that's what we expect from these technologies. So we, we should insist on human agency. That will still lead to all kinds of outcomes and content that will cause division and so on. That's part of the human experience. But this craving for certainty and that we must sort of develop laws or fixed norms that satisfy that is, I think, a futile quest and one that has immense potential to undermine free speech.
Well, thank you all. I think this is the beginning of a very important and ongoing conversation. While we've seen AI a lot longer than many of us have realized, these questions around, how are we going to see these various generative AI platforms handle these questions? What role are there for societal norms? How does this debate fit into our ongoing debates around various questions of free speech is really just starting to take off. So I thank you all for being part of this conversation today. I know I look forward to continuing the conversation with you all. And I think that this has also laid really excellent groundwork, not only for the rest of today's panels, but for those future conversations. So if our audience will please join me in thanking our panelists.